So I'm a neurophysiologist, but I spend my days now really at the intersection of the computational experience, how we model physiological or physiological understanding of the brain, turn that into technologies, and then physiologically how we capture whether that intent is actually getting to where we wanted it to go, and that trying to close that loop. But let's start with this. So, what comes to mind when you look at this image? Earth, planet, yes, climate change, all sorts of things. Well, all quite reasonable too. So I'm in a dark planetarium, completely silent aside from some background music, and watching Journey to the Sun with my 2.5-year-old daughter. And they do this big pan away from the Earth, and at the top of her, as loud as she possibly could, she yells, "Minions." Which actually makes a lot of sense given that her experientially established prior is coming from this image. So thanks to Universal, my daughter has a really good, thinks of little yellow creatures whenever she sees a picture of the Earth right now, but we're going to change that, I promise. How our brain establishes and updates our priors that influence our perception and allow us to probabilistically infer information about the world is critical to how adaptive we are, how successful we are, and how we can navigate a competitive environment. And this is sort of at the core of what I want to talk about today. So this may be familiar with all of you, and I'll have a couple of examples that I hope are familiar. But I want you to think about it in terms of the probabilistic nature of description. So everyone, I want you to watch the voice, watch the person talking here, and focus on their mouth. And think about the McGurk effect. Is everyone familiar with the McGurk effect? Some people, yes, no, good. But focus on what you're seeing and what you hear.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so in that example, did everyone hear something that might have sounded a little bit like da, 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 or tha, tha, tha? All right, so let's do this one more time, and this time I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to just hear the truth of the auditory stimulus as it is.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
All right, do it one more time and realize how much power you have over your experiential perception of the world in this instance.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
So just a summary of what is happening here. He's clearly saying ba, ba, ba. That is the auditory vertical stimulus. But that's been overlaid with the voiced speech of ga, ga, ga. And what does your brain do? It gets it totally wrong, right? It is using your priors and trying to it's got incongruous information coming from your auditory and visual sense and having to put that together in an actionable way because it really wants to get to an actionable object state. And what do you experience? You experience da, 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 or tha, tha, tha. And this is, given a probabilistic nature and the likelihood, how am I going to optimize this incongruent information in a way that can be effective? And it gets it wrong, but in a very effective way that lets you keep moving on in the world. And we do this all the time. This is at the nature of our experiences where priors and probabilistic expectations are driving our sensory experience, creating this non-veridical world that's actionable in state. I happen to love illusions, and I love illusions for a reason, because they tell us about what matters in the brain and what is important. They also give us insight as developers to where there's flexibility and malleability. Because the McGurk effect that we just looked at, our priors do influence that. I promise, if you're in a country with a lot of non-native English speakers sitting in the audience, which some people won't experience the illusion. The minute I give the brain a reason to think that they don't belong together, maybe I'm listening over headphones and watching a screen that's far away, that's enough cue to tell me I shouldn't be trying to integrate this information. I'm going to have a very different experience. So this is a very powerful way of influencing, and figuring out, well, where are these opportunities? And in many cases, our perceptual experiences are well described by models of Bayesian inference. And so that helps us think about things probabilistically. Our environmental, the statistical nature of our environment is influencing our priors and influencing our neural sensitivities at all times. Whether you grew up in a village in Afghanistan or a town in Wisconsin or with the attentional demands of New York or Kathmandu has all affected how you experience information in the world, and you are having a different experience, a different perception of someone sitting next to you. The statistical probabilities of the distributions in these different environments of contour, of color, of the complexity of an acoustic scene, of the temporal demands attentionally happening in these environments affect your neural sensitivities and how you react to information and how you can actually process different pieces of information. So this leads me to sort of what I consider 3 key beliefs that are driving and underlying successful human AI sensory technological development. The first one, that future experiential technologies must consider the holistic sensory human, meaning we can't study one sense or develop for one sense without modeling and predicting the impact one sense is going to have on the other. Those have to go, it has to be a holistic understanding. The experience is malleable, it's contextually driven. The McGurk effect, how we integrate information is going to change based on lighting conditions. If my physiology is maybe compromised in one way that's different to yours, say I have hearing loss in a certain way, I'm going to weight information differentially. My brain is constantly assessing the uncertainty in these pieces of information and how it's making decisions to get me to the best actionable state. And technology development is going to benefit from tracking and closing this loop. And it's getting more and more able. This is something that's happening so rapidly. I mean, in many cases, to some of the presentations we heard already, we're already there. But I'm talking about in the consumer tomorrow, very near term, we're already starting to close this loop. In a way that I like to think, okay, we're actually at a point where the era of the X-Men empath has arrived. We're getting to a place where we can objectify the internal user state and close that loop. And when you are closing the loop between how content is intersecting and how you're actually objectifying that internal state, is going to have a major impact on how we interact with each other socially and our expectations that we have from technology. And in the next sort of few minutes, I want to sort of walk through ways that that's happening and what's happening today. And in the short term, when I say the era of the empath and closing that loop, I'm not talking about full-on BCI. That brain-computer interfaces that are invasive. I'm just talking about the amalgamation of sensors and information, always-on sensors, being combined in weighted in effective ways to give us a very rich portrait of user state in real-time interaction with our technology. And that's powerful and it's quite effective. So 3 key principles. We want to maximize perceptual control, and I'll give you a few examples of that. Because when we're thinking about AI and we're thinking about technologies that intersect our physiology and augment us, I can promise you our perceptual control of things that you might believe today are quite consistent is actually not very robust across a lot of users. We need to understand internal state, and there are a lot of ways we can get there. We need to know what our user is actually experiencing. We want to enhance our physiological experiences, and we want to build technologies that are multisensory and effectively immersive. Those are the things I think about day to day. I've separated it today into what I call control, insight, and creation. So when we think about control, in this case, it's really how do we make sure that we have effective control over the user experience and perception. And that can be in many different ways. Let me give you an example. Now, I want you all to stare up into the right-hand corner, okay? And when you're staring at the right-hand corner, you should see some bubbles that seem to float and fly off the screen. Is that what everyone experiences? All right, now I want you to focus on the bubbles. Shift your gaze. Okay, and so now do you realize you should experience the bubbles as rising vertically? Does everyone, you can go back and forth? Now, just theoretically, if I'm wanting to assure everyone in this room is having the exact same experience of this piece of content, I need to close that loop in some way. I need to know what you're experiencing. I need to know where your gaze is directed, because you can't override what you're experiencing. You can know that two different states exist, but I need to actually have an idea of where your gaze is directed, because it completely changes your experience of the world. In this case, what's happening is you have a conflict of local and global motion, and when those bubbles fall in your foveal region and your gaze is directed on them, you can separate the vertical rise from the horizontal grading that's flying across the bubbles. But when they're in your periphery, your brain is weighting and integrating information about those two different directions in a probabilistic way that is effectively changing that information. And we know this happens in many different ways. So when we think about a closed loop experience, something as simple as having insight to the user state starts to give us a great deal of control of what that experience is. Now, one of the most important things for us as creatures navigating the world is how we form multisensory objects that allow us to action on them. Auditory, visual, haptic. We're integrating information about this object that has a multisensory neural representation that is often incongruous. Now, these two have, and they are taking advantage of our sensory system's attempt to reduce error-prone uncertainty in a way that allows them to have a great, I think it's a lot of fun, but.
No, you can't. Yes, I can. 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 I can say softer. I can say anything softer than you. No, you can't. Yes, I can. No, you can't. Yes, I can. No, you can't. Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
All right. So they're really exploiting one of the most elegant inaccuracies in the neural system, which is, I think, a beautiful thing, because we live in a constant state of ventriloquism. It is often, I'd say most often, if not always, the case that the uncertainty coming from our auditory and our visual system, in this case, it has different uncertainty on it. It's incongruous in the neural representation it presents at the lowest level. And our brain's having to come up with this actionable state where it weights information from our auditory or visual systems, and that changes dependent on, again, the contextual elements and informations. If you don't do this well, a lot of pathological conditions that you're aware of, they actually have difficulty integrating information, forming actionable objects, forming different states. So these are critical features that we do. And what happens? The harder your brain's working, the worse off we are at having to integrate this information. You get changes in cognitive load. You get individuals that you can track this in terms of, we can monitor this from a sensor perspective. These are all things that affect how I experience the world in a successful way. Now, I want to augment my senses. I want to create an augmented world. I want to create a virtual world. So I need to be able to predict how I'm going to integrate information from my senses. And something like ventriloquism, aside from helping us navigate and action on objects in the world as we wander, is also at the core of why we can all go to the movies and have a good experience without transducers plastered across the screen. But it's also then becomes really important, if we want to enhance information, that we know we can engage the physiological system to the end experience in a consistent and effective way. And one of the things, I want to give you an example of how off we are in the technological world at solving what you might think is a fairly robustly solved problem. I want to virtualize an environment. I want to be able to take information about an object and where it is, and I want to make sure that everyone is going to have a consistent experience that is virtualized over, say, two transducers, maybe over headphones or an in-earbud, because I'm trying to give you more information about the state of your world. Okay? This is something that we try to solve in a lot of different industries, and that AI is becoming quite important in how we solve that. But what I'll tell you is that it's actually not solved. And the reason I have this picture is, in many cases, we're going the wrong direction, and we're trying to do it with, it doesn't fit. So let me give you an idea of what's happening there. So really we're in a place where we want to understand how can intelligent computational optimization, personalization of things like our head-related transfer function help us get to a better state. So let's just think about this one problem, which is an isolated problem, but it's one that's critical to interacting with our senses. And what I'll say is this. So we want to create the experience that information is at a specific virtual point. Each one of us has a unique head-related transfer function that's created by the convolutions of our pinna, our torso, the shape of our head. And it's our own cookie cutter, and it imposes a series of amplifications and attenuations across the frequency spectrum that changes as a function of source location in three-dimensional space. And we know this, yet and we can identify key features and parameters that change as you move up, and a source moves up and down in these ways. But we also know we're all unique. And I can take it even a step further and say, we know we're unique, yet there is no headphone or virtualizer you can buy anywhere that doesn't assume one exemplar is, or doesn't take one sample and say, best one size fits all. That's how we approach these problems. And we're trying to have very complex interactions, yet we're saying one size fits all in these cases, and it just doesn't, because even something as simple as a PCA on the parameters or the anthropometry of our bodies, and we color code by gender, and you get basic linear separability in these cases. So one size doesn't fit all, whether it's gender, whether it's demographics, and age. All of these things matter. And we're just starting to get technology to a point where we know they matter, and then we can, in this particular scenario, what I'm trying to show you is each of these red dots indicates where the source was. These are 4 users with all the same systems. And this is what I would call state of the art. Utter fail. If I'm assuming that these 4 individuals are having in any way a comparable internal representation, I'm going to be wrong. I've got to close that loop. Got to close the loop to assure that the perceptual experience is consistent, and I've got to have ways to know that it is without having to put them in a lab. And those are the things we're starting to do more of. I mean, we know we can, technology's gotten to a point where we can easily capture anthropometry in a few seconds from a structure light sensor, and those are showing up everywhere. So we need to leverage as much personalization as we can get to take our technologies to the next level. Now, we have to control perception to be able to build centaurs and get to these states. But the next thing I want to say is, I'm talking about this objectifying the internal state that is going to change how we intersect with a situation. So in these cases, say I've done a bad job estimating or assuming that my users having an experience they aren't, I'm going to be able to pick up on things like cognitive load, on stress, or on different emotional states. All of those things are easily captured today. Now, this is a time series. I can tell you it's GSR data, so it's galvanic skin response. That's all we're measuring in this case. So it's picking up tiny changes in the conductance of your skin as someone's watching some content. Does anyone have a guess what kind of content we're watching here? Cartoons. Pardon? Cartoons. Cartoons? Good guess. Close enough. So it's a soccer match. And this is all part of that insight. How do we close that loop with non-invasive, in some cases, even non-touch sensors? So they're watching a soccer match, and what we realized is we can perfectly predict everywhere there's a penalty kick. And that human anticipation is something that is, you can estimate that. You can build a model. You can identify it. We can know when a user is experiencing something as simple that we can track it in interesting, very robust, rich content. Now, I want to tell you a couple stories. So one of the things about 7 years ago when I joined Dolby, I'm a neurophysiologist, and I found this very, this was a lot of fun because we were developing something called Dolby Vision, which is actually higher dynamic range, wider color gamut. And just for some background, your typical display from 3 years ago went up to about 300 candelas per square meter. The natural moon, when you look at it, is about 1,000 to 2,000 candelas. We can, the human eye can handle 15, 20,000, much higher. So there was this big gap in what technology was providing and what the sensory physiological system was capable of. And I was watching some fire content on this. And fire comes out, there was like a fire dancer. I felt my body react to it. And what happened was, first we established that the display was constant, wasn't giving off heat, and then we go and we get thermal cameras. And we are able to track points on people's individual faces in reaction to the content. So this told us something about their priors, aside from redefining at our company how we wanted to think about immersive technology and that we really needed to be intersecting authentically the physiological system. It gave us insight that we could, when we wander the world and experience flame, just based on the luminance reaching my retina and my priors of flame being hot, my body is starting to expel heat before I even can, feel any warmth. So that was a powerful change. And it's led to companies like Pixar using these types of technologies. In this case, when the baby's born, they actually are trying to get you to feel pain and elicit an experience that is much more than your, what I would call the aesthetic. It's a physiological experience that we can track and monitor. And we do that. We can use your pupil. We can look at pupil diameters. There's a lot of research in pupillometry, but we can track cognitive load very easily with, this is showing multiple talkers, and the minute 2 talkers kick in, we can see an immediate change in diameter, and you can track this across a lot of psychophysical stimuli and recreate experiments. This is one I really love. You may not realize, that when you go watch The Hunger Games or Hitchcock, there is a broadcasted chemical signal coming from us that can be tracked and even visually predict what movie you're watching in these cases. So you're looking at exhalants, things like, carbon dioxide, acetone, isoprene, things that are, what do we do when we're under fear or stress? We do breathe more, but we also might have different, our muscles, the way we react to content is different into the stimuli. And it's something that you can track. You can track this in a predictable way where you're able to go back and identify what was even happening very quickly at that time that was causing this audience, this broadcasted collective audience interaction. And I think we're all aware, too, the power of where we're getting to with non-contact emotion sensing. And that's something that AI is really taking to another level. So in that way, we've gone to where we have this very rich stimulus set that lets us close this loop. And I'm going to quickly talk through one element that I see a lot of, where AI is intersecting and closing this loop in a way that we're able to have a very rich sensory experience that affects potentially how we intersect with others in the world. So the ear is an exceptionally rich place to capture information and to close the loop with the user. Everyone's familiar with assistants, and in-ear sensors, we can capture heart rate. Crude forms of EEG today that are getting better. We're able to capture blood oxygen levels. You have a direct interface to the user as well. We're able to, through the ear, enhance task optimization, digital, whether it's how you take information and make a user perform in a more enhanced way given the context. You can have real-time, always adaptive to the contextual environment changes in what the user is experiencing, and you can be tracking their voice intersection, but also a rich background of user intent, user state, just through the ear. And you can also then expand the capacity limitations of one sense. as we enhance our environments and intersect our senses, we are capacity limited. And if we put everything in our visual sense, you can't get much more data. More data is not better. It's how we distribute that data and how we use that information in different ways that allow us to optimize the information. Whether it's sensors, microphones picking up on the statistical probabilities and making inferences to my content that's somehow feeding information into me, not necessarily through voice, because that again is a capacity limitation. It's how do we take that information and expand our senses in ways that let us be more effective. We can track objects. We can have positional stationarity of things that guide us in different ways. But again, these all require that internal user state is understood, robust, and consistent. So I have just a few more thoughts I want to share. And I think where we've heard many things today that I think everyone will hopefully agrees to is that technology that targets our senses is critical. And we have to understand that loop to human perception, make sure it's closed, but we also have to identify that as we move in that direction, our physiological systems continually adapting. And you can't escape neuroplasticity. You want to embrace it. It's critical to the success of our technologies. As we become a lot of the technologies that will most enhance our capabilities, our physiology is not yet set up to even handle, and it will have to be trained. And we will want to track this loop and continually capture it. But then the question I ask is, as we close that loop, as we close this empathetic loop to understanding our internal states, I know if you're having difficulty hearing in a complex environment and my device is capturing my cognitive load, or you can see my anticipation of an event such that my choice to have a poker face isn't no longer my agency. It's going to affect how we socially communicate. It's also going to affect our expectations on technology. Because right now, I think our expectations of how successful and how consistent technology should be in the experience it provides are, they're not anywhere near as high as they will be. And they're definitely heterogeneous across the groups. But always-on sensors tracking our internal state will take us to a different direction in how we have to think about that. And finally, more information that we have is all going to be about the success of how we dimensionally reduce this information to be actionable. So the thermal image, I gave you an example where I could capture your reaction to flame and capture this. I can also track cognitive load. I can track stress. I can track a lot of rich human emotions when combined with these other sensors. Giving you all that information, or giving me all that information, is not going to be effective at making me more human, making me able to interact better socially. I'm not saying I want a mood ring that tells me something, but what we have to work towards is very much how we take this very rich data and make it far more than a Wikipedia that is removing us from our emotional connection to to others, and to the creative components that make us human. In that way, I want to leave you with something I think we all agree to, which is the three-legged race is something that we cannot stop. And it's the three-legged race between the computer scientists, the controls optimization theorists, the neuroscientists, and very much the psychologists and cognitive scientists. And what I mean by the three-legged race is that you're working lockstep, you're working together, you're aware of each other, and you're continually interacting on what the successful state of these intersections between the technologies we can build and what the right experiences we should be targeting to really enhance our state and our day will be. So thank you very much.